This video includes animation of a plane crash with real audio from the cockpit that might be disturbing for some viewers. 8 people died when the aircraft they were flying in crashed and broke apart when they were trying to land, and the investigation that followed revealed over 1,700 pages of details about how this happened and the final moments of the flight that led up to this terrible tragedy. This is probably the most horrifying pilot mistake story that I've ever told on this channel. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins when 2 pilots and 6 passengers boarded an aircraft in Atlantic City to make a routine flight to Owatonna, Minnesota, a small city not far south of Minneapolis. The purpose of the trip was to meet with a local glass company to discuss the design and purchase of glass for a casino that was being built in Atlantic City. Karen, Mark, Alan, Tony, Chris, and Chip all boarded the aircraft having no idea it would be their last flight, and my heart goes out to their family and friends. In order to understand the horrifying mistakes that were made during the final moments of their flight, we need to start by looking at the pilots that were flying the plane, because I would consider them victims of this terrible tragedy as well. CJ was 40 years old, and he was the captain in the left seat, and he was also the pilot flying at the time of the crash. He originally earned his private pilot certificate in January of 2002, then he got his commercial certificate in July and became a flight instructor 4 months after that. He was eventually hired by a company called East Coast Jets in January 2005, where he earned his multi-engine airline transport pilot certificate in October of that year with a type rating in the Hawker Beechcraft 125-800. CJ had about 3,600 total flight hours, including over 2,700 as pilot in command, with almost 1,200 hours in the Hawker Beechcraft. One of the interesting details discovered during the investigation was that according to his girlfriend and other witnesses, CJ would typically go to bed around 10 p.m. and he got between 8.5 and 12 hours of sleep a night. Additionally, he would take a 2.5 to 3 hour nap in the afternoon every day. That amounts to about 11 to 15 hours of sleep every day. The reason I'm bringing this up is because on the night before the accident, he stayed up late playing poker and didn't go to bed until midnight, and then he woke up around 5 a.m. to start his day. So his fatigue would turn out to play a role in what happened during the flight. Dan was 27 years old, and he was the first officer in the right seat and the pilot monitoring for the flight. Dan earned his private pilot certificate in July of 2001 and his commercial certificate about 4 years later in August of 2005. He would go on to become a flight instructor in 2006 before he was hired by East Coast Jets in October of 2007, where he obtained a type rating in the Hawker Beechcraft 125 1 month later. Dan had almost 1,500 total flight hours with over 950 as pilot in command, but he only had 295 hours on the Hawker, so he had significantly less experience on the aircraft than CJ did, which is something else that would factor into this tragedy. Additionally, Dan had trouble sleeping the night before the trip, so he took Ambien and he went to bed around 11 p.m. and woke up at 5 a.m. to start the day. His autopsy later revealed that the Ambien was still in his system at the time of the crash. And although the NTSB said it was unlikely that it degraded his performance during the flight, they also went on to say that fatigue played a role in what happened. Either way, we'll talk more about the pilots later when we see what happened during the flight. For right now, we need to talk about the company they worked for and the training they received. CJ and Dan worked for East Coast Jets, a Part 135 charter company that held a platinum safety rating and was known for their high retention rate with a lack of pilot turnover compared to other companies in the industry. Now, typically the company preferred to hire pilots with at least 1,500 hours, including some multi-engine and jet time, often seeking out the best pilots available. New hires would normally start off as a co-pilot on a Learjet before moving to become a co-pilot on the Hawker Beechcraft, and then they become captain on the Lear before becoming captain on the Hawker. And the goal was for all of that to happen within about 2 years. Although that might seem reasonable, the problem was arguably how the process was implemented. According to a captain that worked for the company, flying with new pilots required a lot of babysitting, but after a period you could start letting them do their duties with less oversight. The director of operations said first officers were told to just sit there and not touch anything, and that they were a detriment to the flight before they progressed and could be trusted to make landings on empty legs and then on flights with passengers. Keep in mind that you need at least 2 pilots to fly the Hawker or the Learjet. They're not designed for one of the pilots to just sit there and not touch anything. And to be honest, I don't know how comfortable passengers would be if you told them one of their pilots was a detriment to the flight. Additionally, the company didn't provide any specific guidance for captains on how to train first officers, never mind the fact that some captains don't even want to be instructors and they might have little to no experience instructing. There also wasn't any formalized CRM training provided by the company teaching pilots how to effectively operate as a crew and work together. The topic was listed in their training manual, but no course content was provided, so pilots were essentially left to figure it out themselves. That being said, all of the company pilots received their training at SimCom International in Orlando, Florida, where they were taught standardized flow patterns, checklist, pilot flying and pilot monitoring responsibilities, as well as standard callouts made when running checklist. This was all part of the standard operating procedures that were part of SimCom's manuals, and that's the good news. The bad news is at that time, East Coast jets didn't have any standard operating procedures, so pilots would focus on the standards in training with SimCom, but when it came to real-world flying, they would often forget what they were taught. In fact, the investigation discovered that company pilots couldn't cite or explain SimCom's standardized procedures consistently. Now, in full transparency, East Coast jets weren't required to have standardized procedures. The FAA just recommends having them because SOPs are essential to safe aviation operations, and they're also necessary for effective crew coordination and performance. When it comes to checklist usage, SimCom's procedures require that all checklists be initiated by the pilot flying, and after the checklist was complete, the pilot not flying should state "checklist is complete." And they also stressed checklist discipline throughout the entire training program. The only problem with that was the checklists that pilots were using in training weren't the same checklists they used with East Coast jets. As an example, none of the checklists with SimCom were considered silent checklists, whereas East Coast jets had several checklists that were supposed to be done silently. In addition, some of the checklist items were different and located in different places on the checklist. As a result, sometimes pilots would bring the company checklist with them to training to reference, but that wasn't always the case. It turned out that CJ brought his checklist with him, but Dan didn't. This is why I refer to the pilots as victims in this tragedy as well. They certainly made some horrifying mistakes that we're going to talk about soon, but the NTSB also highlighted how the FAA failed to require CRM training and standard operating procedures for private charter companies, which is something that perhaps could have prevented this tragedy. Regardless, now that we know more about the pilots and their training, it's time to talk about the aircraft they were flying and the weather on the day of the crash. The aircraft that CJ and Dan were flying in was a 1991 Hawker Beechcraft 125-800. This is a twin turbofan executive jet that requires 2 pilots to operate. The aircraft was equipped with a cockpit voice recorder that we're going to review in a minute, but it didn't have a flight data recorder, so the investigation had to rely on what was said in the cockpit as well as what was found in the wreckage. Eventually, the NTSB was able to determine that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that might have contributed to the crash, but here's what you need to know about the aircraft itself. First of all, the aircraft flap handle is located on the right side of the center pedestal, and the air brake handle is on the left side. The reason why this is important is because if you move the air brake handle up and out of the open position and fully aft to the dump position when the flaps are set to 45 degrees, it activates a lift dump feature. This causes the flaps to extend beyond their normal range to 75 degrees, and it also gives you about an extra 20 degrees of spoilers, which is basically going to help put more weight on the wheels and help the aircraft slow down faster. This is going to be important to remember later on. For right now, another big factor in what happened was the weather. According to the investigation, CJ printed out a pre-flight weather briefing package around 5 a.m. the morning of the flight, which was about 4.5 hours before the accident. The report said that the weather in Owatonna was calm winds with clear skies, and even though Owatonna didn't have a forecast, 5 different airports nearby were all predicting calm winds with clear skies or scattered clouds at 14,000 feet. After that first flight to Atlantic City to pick up the passengers, CJ and Dan both logged on to a weather page about 20 to 40 minutes before the flight to get an update, and the weather radar picture still looked clear. However, what they didn't realize was that the National Weather Service had issued multiple severe weather watches before they even took off from Atlantic City, warning about a line of severe thunderstorms that was moving through southern Minnesota. Unfortunately, CJ and Dan didn't get any in-flight updates about the weather, so what they were about to get themselves into caught them completely by surprise. Before we talk about what happened next, I want to clarify that the information I use for making these videos is all part of the NTSB docket online. And even though that's public record, it still contains deeply personal details. So I take that responsibility seriously. And speaking of protecting personal information, there's one name I turn to for that, and that's Delete Me. If you've never heard of them, Delete Me's mission is simple. They believe you have a right to own, manage, and remove your personal information from the internet, and that's why their goal is to help you do that by removing your data from hundreds of data broker websites. You see, data brokers are these companies that crawl the internet trying to find things like your birthday, your address, your social security number, even information about who your relatives are, and then they sell that data to whoever wants it. The reason this is so important is because identity theft and fraud are a huge risk, and the number of cases have nearly tripled over the last decade. But the good news is that removing your data will help you protect yourself from the risk of identity theft. That's why I personally trust and recommend Delete Me, and I've been using them for a long time. Delete Me scours the internet to find these data broker sites, and then they work to get my personal data removed. In fact, just recently they reviewed over 2,700 listings and found 9 data brokers with my personal information that they were able to get removed for me. So if you believe in the right to keep your personal information private like I do, just go to joindeleteme.com/debrief and use the promo code debrief to get 20% off. And I've also put a link in the video description, or you can just scan the QR code on the screen to get 20% off. And thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to the debrief. When CJ and Dan were about 50 miles from the airport, things started to fall apart, because that was when Dan tuned the radio to get the current weather observation for Owatonna. The broadcast was reporting thunderstorms and rain, but he didn't bother to mention that to CJ, and there wasn't any further discussion in the cockpit about the weather. A few seconds later, the controller asked them if they were seeing extreme precipitation about 20 miles directly in front of them, and Dan replied that they were painting it, meaning they saw it on their weather radar, and he asked what the cloud bases were. Keep in mind that they're about 20 minutes from landing right now, and the investigation said that this was the first indication that the pilots had that the weather was bad. However, I'd argue that because they were flying in VMC conditions, they should have been able to look out the front window and see the big wall of storms out in front of them, so this shouldn't have been a surprise. Either way, the controller told him he didn't know about the bases, but the cloud tops were quite high, and he didn't recommend that they try to go through it, and instead perhaps they should deviate to the right. Once again, without any discussion about the weather, Dan requested to deviate to the right. This image shows you their flight track in white, and you can see just how close they got to the storm as they deviated around it. But instead of taking a few minutes to discuss the plan for how they were going to get to the airport, Dan asked for a lower altitude, and CJ said, "Let's hope we get underneath it." Then Dan tried to blame the controller, saying if he would have descended them sooner, it probably wouldn't have been an issue, as he's just now realizing they're 50 miles out and still at 24,000 feet. The controller asked them to state their intentions and what they wanted to do because he couldn't give them a good recommendation based on the weather, and that's when CJ hopped on the radio saying that they would continue about 40 miles before turning left towards the field. They were soon cleared to descend to 14,000 feet, and during the initial part of that descent, they should have completed the descent checklist. The only problem is there's no evidence that ever happened. Instead, the only thing CJ said was, "Ice is on, ignitions are on, wings are on," referring to the anti-ice as they started going through the weather, and he joked that it was a good thing he didn't tell the passengers it would be a smooth ride. CJ would then go on to complain about the controller asking for his intentions, and he told Dan, "I ain't gonna turn around and go home," which in my opinion is a classic sign of get-there-itis. He's gonna make it to their destination no matter what, and there wasn't any discussion of possible alternatives. This is where I need to let you know that this wasn't considered typical behavior for CJ. The other pilots that flew with him considered him to be very meticulous and disciplined, especially when it came to the weather, and there was never any pressure from the company or the passengers to make this flight happen. The NTSB could only theorize that perhaps his actions were in part due to his fatigue. You see, oftentimes when you're fatigued, you're more likely to accept risky decisions and you're slow to reevaluate new information, which usually results in a very poor risk assessment. To make matters worse, as they were trying to pick their way through the weather, Dan said that he was going to go off frequency so that he could call the FBO, which is the facility where they're landing, presumably to let them know that they were inbound. The reason why this wasn't a good choice is because they're in a high workload phase of flight right now, still trying to figure out how to get around the weather. And as the captain, CJ needed to say, "Negative, stand by, I need your help right now, and we'll call the FBO later." But he didn't do that, and instead he started talking to the controller, requesting a turn to the left towards the airfield. Unfortunately, the storms would be the least of their worries, as they had no idea they only had about 12 minutes left to live. As they continued the descent, they were told to contact the approach controller, and Dan requested the ILS approach to runway 30. This is about the time where they would normally accomplish the approach checklist, and they at least made an attempt to do that because CJ said, "Let's do the approaches real quick," and they verified the harnesses, the fuel, and the flight deck heat. Then Dan called for the approach briefing, but the only thing CJ said was, "It's going to be the ILS to 30. This was a huge mistake that I've talked about countless times on this channel, because the approach briefing is your chance to talk about the type of approach you're flying, the runway conditions, the aircraft configuration, your approach speed, the decision altitude, basically all of the details associated with the approach as well as the missed approach procedure. In fact, CJ is the one that's supposed to brief it because he's the one flying it. However, my guess is they didn't do the checklist because they were too far behind the aircraft and they ran out of time. The deviation around the weather led to CJ focusing on navigating while Dan wasn't paying attention since he was still trying to talk to the FBO, so now everything was very rushed. About a minute later, the controller started giving them vectors for the ILS, and that's when he told the pilots that he got the weather for them and it was 20 minutes old, but showing the winds were 320 at 8 knots with a visibility of 10 miles with thunderstorms and a broken ceiling at 4,500 feet. There are two important takeaways from this radio call. First of all, the weather update was 20 minutes old. And even though winds that are 320 at 8 knots indicate a headwind, a lot can change when you have rapidly moving thunderstorms through the area. That's one of the threats to keep in mind with an uncontrolled field when you're the only one flying. And if CJ or Dan had been thinking about the winds, then they might have looked at their flight instruments, which give them an actual readout of the current winds, and they would have seen that they had a tailwind. According to the investigation, the FMS recorded the winds being 195 at 17 knots when they were about to land on runway 30. That meant they had a 5.6 knot tailwind, and further evaluation of the data reflected it was an 8 knot tailwind when they actually touched down. The other huge concern was that the runway was wet, which was also going to affect their landing distance. The truth is that according to the investigation, they needed just under 4,000 feet to land if they had a 10 knot headwind, compared to over 5,000 feet with a 10 knot tailwind. However, those distances didn't include a correction for a wet runway. So if you added a 15% safety margin, CJ and Dan needed about 5,800 feet to land on a runway that was only 5,500 feet long. This is why they should have landed on runway 12 with the headwind, but they weren't thinking about that because they were getting distracted by the weather radar, with CJ saying that he didn't know what he was looking at and neither did Dan. They weren't sure if the radar was pointed up or down too far, and they didn't know if they still had storms in front of them that they were going to have to fly through. About a minute later, they started slowing down to their final approach speed, and Dan offered to try and call the FBO again, and CJ told him to go for it. Once again, this was a non-essential task that could have been done after they landed, and CJ should have said, "No, help me with the approach." Thankfully, about a minute later, they had the runway in sight, and when they were on about an 8-mile final, Dan finally got a hold of the FBO to talk about the passengers and to find out where they needed to taxi to get fuel. In the meantime, CJ was on the other radio talking to the controller, while at the same time he's lowering the landing gear and calling out items on the before landing checklist as if he's conducting single pilot operations. Now, some people might say there was a huge breakdown in CRM during this flight, but I'd argue that CRM never existed in this cockpit. Even though CJ might have been very supportive of first officers, he wasn't effectively using Dan as a pilot monitoring during the flight. Instead, he was giving him busy work to do, like calling the FBO, and treating Dan like he was just along for the ride. But the thing is, that's what the company culture was like at the time of this crash, because remember, new first officers were just supposed to sit there and not touch anything. A few seconds later, CJ asked Dan to go through the before landing checklist to make sure he got it all, even though CJ had already performed the steps in the checklist. At this point, they were inside the final approach fix and about 90 seconds from landing, and now we're at the most horrifying part of this entire story. Before I show you what happened next, I need to warn you that the clip you're about to watch is very disturbing. However, I decided to share it with you so you can understand how some of the mistakes were made during the final moments of this flight. And also, I think that when you hear the audio instead of reading the words on paper, it helps us remember that these are real people. And I never want something like this to happen to anyone. And that's the whole reason why I do these debriefs. Now, to give you some context for the animation, the aircraft is going to touch down at roughly 122 knots, about 1,100 feet down the runway, which was on speed and in the target touchdown zone. As soon as the wheels hit the ground, CJ was supposed to move the air brake handle to the dump position to dump the lift so they can slow down, like I talked about earlier in the video. You're going to hear Dan say that they're dumped, and then 2 seconds later, he recognized that they aren't dumped, meaning CJ didn't pull the air brake handle all the way aft. That's when CJ will immediately move the handle to dump the lift, but what happened next makes this the most horrifying pilot mistake story that I've ever talked about on this channel.
Damper. Or dump. Or not dump. No, we're not. Flaps. There we go. Not flying. Not my flying.
As terrible as this tragedy was, the truth is that it was easily avoidable. You see, by the time CJ moved the air brake handle to the dump position, they had already been on the ground for 7 seconds. And at that point, they had two options. They could try to stop and accept the fact that they'd go off the runway, or they could try to get airborne. In this case, obviously CJ decided to go around, but that was 17 seconds after they landed and about 9 seconds after he had dumped the lift. He immediately stowed the air brakes and he raised the flaps to 0, even though the go-around checklist says to only raise the flaps to 15 degrees. It didn't really matter though, because it wasn't possible for them to take off before the end of the runway, regardless of the position of the flaps. They rolled through the grass almost 1,000 feet beyond the end of the runway before they barely got airborne and hit the ILS antenna 5 feet above the ground. The aircraft continued rolling to the right and crashed inverted, breaking apart, killing everyone on board. The most tragic part about this entire story, though, was that the NTSB determined that if they had stayed on the ground, the aircraft would have exited the runway between 23 and 37 knots ground speed and stopped about 100 to 300 feet beyond the end of the runway in the grass within the designated runway safety area. The NTSB published 26 findings at the conclusion of their investigation and said that the probable cause was the captain's decision to attempt to go around with insufficient runway remaining. But the reason that happened was due to poor crew coordination and a lack of cockpit discipline. If they had just been more disciplined about running the checklist, doing an approach brief, and talking about the weather, they might have landed on runway 12, and this never would have happened. I hope you found this debrief helpful and were able to learn something from it. And if you did, then be sure to watch my video about the most disturbing pilot mistake story that I've ever talked about on my channel by clicking on the video on the screen or using the link in the comments below. And by the way, thanks again to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. To get your data removed from the internet, check out Delete Me via the link in my description and get 20% off, and I'll see you on the next debrief.